27 days ago, on April 2nd, 2026, China's General Administration of Customs released a small data table that almost no Western news outlet covered. The table reported Chinese crude oil imports for the month of March. Embedded in that table was a number that should have set off alarms in every energy ministry in Washington: 1.8 million barrels per day. That was the volume of Iranian crude oil that arrived at Chinese ports during the worst month of the United States and Israeli air campaign against Iran. It is the highest monthly Iranian oil intake China has ever recorded. It is approximately 40% higher than the same month 1 year ago. And it occurred during a period in which the United States Navy was actively positioning carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, the Israeli Air Force was bombing Iranian nuclear sites, and the Trump administration was telling the American public that maximum pressure was working. The maximum pressure campaign was not working. It was supplying China with oil at a discount. Tonight, we are going to walk through the story that Washington has been almost completely unable to tell itself for the last 60 days. The story of how a Persian Gulf War, launched by the United States to demonstrate American power, has instead delivered the largest strategic windfall to the People's Republic of China since the financial crisis of 2008. Not on a battlefield, not in a treaty. In the quiet accumulation of cheap energy, of yuan-denominated contracts, of port lease extensions, of mediation credibility, and of every diplomatic and economic asset that Beijing has spent the last 15 years patiently positioning for exactly this kind of moment. The Iran war is not just failing to contain China. It is the single greatest strategic accelerant for Chinese power that any American administration has handed Beijing in this century. That sentence will sound like an exaggeration. By the end of this analysis, I think you will see why it is not. If you want the version of this story that the briefing rooms in Washington are not telling and the cable news segments are not connecting, hit subscribe right now. Because the developments of the next 30 days are going to make this picture even more uncomfortable than it already is, and you do not want to be catching up after the fact. Let us start with the oil itself. Before Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, Iran was exporting approximately 1.5 million barrels of crude oil per day, almost all of it to a single buyer: China. The mechanism by which this trade has operated for the last several years is one of the most carefully constructed sanctions evasion architectures in modern economic history. Iranian crude is loaded onto tankers. The tankers conduct ship-to-ship transfers in the Gulf of Oman or in the South China Sea. The cargo is rebranded, often as Malaysian or Omani crude. It enters China through small independent refineries known in the industry as teapot refineries, concentrated in Shandong province. The payments are made in yuan, routed through Chinese state banks, and recorded in a financial settlement system that the United States Treasury can observe but cannot reach. After the war began, two things happened simultaneously. Iran lost most of its other potential buyers. India, which had been quietly absorbing some Iranian crude, faced direct American pressure and reduced its purchases. Turkey, which had been functioning as an overland corridor, became politically nervous about the heightened scrutiny. Even the small remaining trade with European intermediaries effectively froze. Iran had one customer left who was willing to absorb the political cost of the trade: China. That customer knew exactly what its bargaining position was. According to multiple shipping intelligence reports, the spread between Iranian crude and Brent has expanded to $20 to $25 per barrel as of the end of April. At $110 Brent, China is paying roughly $85 to $90 per barrel for crude that the United States has decided no other major economy is allowed to buy. That is not a sanctions failure. That is a sanctions-enabled subsidy. Despite the blockade announced on April 13th, Chinese imports of Iranian crude in the first 3 weeks of April are tracking higher than March, not lower. Vessel tracking data from Kepler, Tanker Trackers, and Lloyd's List Intelligence all show the same pattern. Iranian crude is loading at Chabahar, on Iran's southeastern coast, which does not require Strait of Hormuz transit. It is sailing around the Indian subcontinent. It is conducting ship-to-ship transfers in the open Indian Ocean, and it is arriving in Shandong province at volumes that would make any Iranian sanctions enforcement official from a previous administration weep. Now consider what this means in dollar terms. 2 million barrels per day at a $25 discount is a $50 million daily transfer of value from Iran to China relative to the global market price. Over a year, that is roughly $18 billion. Over the next decade, assuming the structural conditions persist, it is in the range of $180 billion. That is a Chinese subsidy to the operation of its own industrial base, paid for by Iranian desperation, made possible by an American policy designed to cripple Iran. To put that figure in perspective, $180 billion is roughly the entire annual research and development budget of the Chinese state for advanced technology, and it is being delivered to Beijing not by espionage, not by trade negotiation, but by the structural incentives the American sanctions regime has created. This brings us to the second dimension of China's strategic gain. Because the oil is not being paid for in dollars, the petrodollar system, established in the 1970s after the collapse of Bretton Woods, was the financial scaffolding on which American economic primacy was built. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil in dollars. The rest of OPEC followed. Every barrel sold anywhere in the world generated demand for the United States currency. That demand is what allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits without facing the currency depreciation that any other country would have suffered. It is what gave American sanctions their teeth. That system has been weakening for several years. The weaponization of dollar sanctions against Russia after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine sent a signal to every government in the world. The dollar reserves you hold are subject to political risk. Diversification is no longer an academic exercise. It is a national security imperative. The Iran war has accelerated that shift dramatically. Every barrel of Iranian crude China imports is paid for in yuan. The settlement passes through the cross-border interbank payment system known as CIPS, which is China's alternative to the SWIFT messaging network that underpins dollar-denominated trade. According to data released by the People's Bank of China and partially confirmed by independent analysts, CIPS transaction volumes in March 2026 were approximately 37% higher than March of the previous year. The growth was concentrated in energy and commodity transactions, particularly with Russian, Iranian, and Central Asian counterparties. The total dollar equivalent of CIPS transactions in March alone exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in the system's history. That is a structural shift in how a measurable share of the global oil trade is being settled. And every dollar of trade that moves outside the dollar system reduces, marginally but cumulatively, the demand base that makes American sanctions work. The Iran war has done what 15 years of Chinese strategic communication could not do. It has given Beijing a real-time demonstration to every neutral and non-aligned country in the world of why holding dollar reserves is a political risk. Saudi Arabia is watching. The United Arab Emirates is watching. India is watching. Brazil and Turkey are watching. None of those governments is going to abandon the dollar tomorrow. But every one of them is now expanding the share of their reserves and their trade that they keep outside the dollar system. The third dimension is geographic. Look at a map of Southwest Asia. Find the Strait of Hormuz. Then trace the Iranian coastline east, past Bandar Abbas, past the Persian Gulf, around the corner where the coast turns from south-facing to east-facing. There you will find Chabahar, a deep-water port on the Gulf of Oman, on the open Indian Ocean that does not require Hormuz transit to reach the world. This is the geographic fact that breaks the entire blockade theory. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz only matters if Iranian oil has to leave through the Strait of Hormuz. It does not. That port was built with Indian and later Chinese investment, deliberately, as an alternative to the Hormuz-dependent ports. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, financed a parallel network of infrastructure on the Pakistani side of the border, including the deepwater port at Gwadar, just 170 kilometers east of Chabahar. Gwadar is operated under a long-term lease by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The ports are linked by the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC, a network of roads, rail, and pipelines that connects western China through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. For most of the last decade, Western analysts treated CPEC as a vanity project. Massive overspend, Pakistani debt traps, security problems. The standard list of reasons why American policymakers did not need to take Chinese infrastructure investments seriously. Today, CPEC is the physical asset that is making the United States naval blockade of Iran ineffective. Chinese-flagged vessels are loading Iranian crude at Chabahar. They are sailing east into the Indian Ocean without ever entering the Persian Gulf. They are calling at Gwadar for fuel and routine port services. They are continuing to Chinese refineries in Shandong, Jiang, and Guangdong. The route does not touch the Strait of Hormuz at any point. The United States Navy can blockade Hormuz indefinitely, and it will not stop a single barrel from moving along this corridor. And the political problem for Washington is not just operational, it is doctrinal. The United States can only stop these ships by intercepting them on the high seas, or by pressuring Pakistan to refuse them port services. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state with a long history of cooperation with China and a leadership that has explicitly stated it will not be bullied into supporting the blockade. So the ships keep moving, the oil keeps flowing, and every cargo that reaches Qingdao through the CPEC corridor is a quiet validation of 15 years of Chinese strategic planning that Washington dismissed as wasteful. If you are starting to see how the pieces of this story connect, hit the like button right now. Because the next dimension of China's gain is the diplomatic one, and it is the part that has the longest tail. For 60 years, the United States has been the indispensable mediator in Middle Eastern conflicts. From Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in the 1970s, to the Camp David Accords, to the Madrid Conference, to the Abraham Accords, every major regional realignment has flowed through American leverage. That role is in serious question tonight. When the Islamabad peace talks collapsed on April 12th, the obvious next question was, who picks up the mediation? The Trump administration declared that there would be no more talks until Iran complied with American demands. Pakistan, which had hosted the failed talks, signaled that it was withdrawing from the role. The European Union expressed concerns that did not translate into action. The United Nations Secretary-General called for restraint, which is the diplomatic equivalent of saying nothing while saying something. Beijing did not call for restraint. Beijing offered to host new talks. According to reporting by the South China Morning Post, Reuters, and Al Jazeera, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held separate phone calls with his Iranian, Saudi, and Russian counterparts in the 72 hours after the Islamabad collapse. China is positioning itself as the only major power capable of bringing the relevant regional parties to a single table. That positioning has historical precedent. In March of 2023, China brokered the surprise restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That deal was treated in Washington as a curiosity, a one-off, a symbolic gesture by Beijing that would not produce durable results. 3 years later, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not at war with each other, despite a regional conflict that has every structural condition that historically would have aligned them on opposite sides. The Chinese-mediated détente has held. Beijing's mediation portfolio is now expanding to include the Iran-United States war, and every government in the region is watching to see whether the United States can prevent it. So far, the answer has been no. American diplomatic capital is too damaged by the unconditional surrender rhetoric, by the 7 kilotons threat, by the alienation of allies through the blockade, and by the alleged $20 billion settlement offer that the president himself spent a decade calling a betrayal of the country. Beijing has none of those problems. It has not threatened anyone. It has not promised anyone unconditional surrender. Its hands are clean in a way that, fairly or unfairly, no American administration's hands could be at this moment. That is diplomatic capital, and it is being deposited in Beijing's account every time a regional government concludes that calling Washington produces threats, while calling Beijing produces results. For half a century, that calculation ran the other direction. Washington had the carrots. Beijing had the lectures. The carrots and the lectures have switched hands, and most of the people in Washington who built their careers on the old arrangement have not yet absorbed what that means for the next 20 years. The Saudi pivot deserves its own attention. It is the single most consequential diplomatic shift inside the Persian Gulf, and it is the one that American analysts have been most reluctant to acknowledge. Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia is the country whose 1974 agreement with the Nixon administration gave the dollar its anchor in the global oil trade. Saudi Arabia is also the country that for 50 years was treated in Washington as a permanent client state. Riyadh has somewhere else to go now. In 2023, Saudi Arabia agreed to start accepting yuan for some Chinese oil purchases. In 2024, Saudi Arabia formalized closer ties with the BRICS Plus expanded economic bloc. In 2025, Saudi Arabia signed a series of energy infrastructure agreements with Chinese state-owned enterprises that committed Riyadh to long-term cooperation on Belt and Road projects. And in the last 60 days, since Operation Epic Fury, Saudi Arabia has done something that no American policymaker would have predicted as recently as 2024. It has refused to publicly endorse the United States' position on the Iran war. It has not cut Iranian diplomatic ties. It has not joined the blockade. It has instead quietly maintained the channel of communication with Tehran that the Chinese-mediated détente of 2023 opened. The petrodollar system depends on Saudi Arabia's continued willingness to anchor it. That willingness is no longer guaranteed, and every week that the Iran war continues, the political calculation in Riyadh tilts a little further toward the conclusion that Beijing is the more reliable long-term partner. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves explicit attention. It is the dimension that demonstrates Chinese strategic discipline most clearly. It is the things Beijing has not done. Beijing has not endorsed Iran. It has not signed a mutual defense treaty. It has not committed military forces. It has not threatened the United States Navy. What Beijing has done is the opposite. It has called for restraint by all parties. It has expressed concern about civilian casualties. It has urged a return to diplomacy. The language is mild. The diplomatic temperature is cool. The official Chinese position would not look out of place in a press release from any Western European foreign ministry. That is not weakness. That is discipline. Beijing has correctly assessed that public alignment with Iran would solidify the American hard line. Public confrontation with the United States would force European partners to choose sides in a way that would benefit Washington. The strategic optimum for China is to remain visibly neutral, quietly accumulate the economic and diplomatic gains the war is producing, and let the United States exhaust itself against an adversary that China does not need to defend. This is the playbook that Sun Tzu wrote in the 5th century before the Common Era. To win without fighting is the supreme excellence. American policymakers have read those lines many times. They are watching Beijing execute them in real time. And so far, the response from Washington has been to do exactly what Beijing wanted. Let us name the cost to the United States explicitly. First, energy market position. Every barrel of Iranian crude that flows to China at a $25 discount is a barrel that gives Chinese refiners a structural cost advantage over American refiners using market price imports. The Iranian discount is funding Chinese industrial competitiveness for the duration of the war and likely beyond. Second, financial system primacy. CIPS transaction volumes are not going back down after the war ends. The infrastructure for non-dollar settlement is being built, tested, and proven during the war. Every counterparty that successfully settles a transaction in yuan during the crisis is a counterparty that has demonstrated to itself that the alternative system works. Third, alliance cohesion. Every American ally that has expressed reservations about the blockade, every government that has refused to endorse the unconditional surrender language, every European partner that has signaled discomfort with the 7 kilotons threat, those positions are now part of the historical record. The next time Washington asks for Allied support on a major military operation, the conversation in every capital will start with what happened in 2026. Fourth, regional credibility. Every Gulf state has now seen that American security guarantees come bundled with a willingness to start wars that those states have to absorb the economic consequences of. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar are not abandoning the United States, but they are diversifying their relationships in ways that will accelerate as long as American policy continues to produce regional crises that disrupt their economies. Fifth, the petrodollar itself. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic moment, but a gradual erosion of the demand base that has underpinned American economic exceptionalism for 50 years. These costs are not theoretical. They are the actual price of the war, separate from and in addition to the direct military and humanitarian costs. There is a historical parallel worth naming. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The United States, working with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, channeled support to the Mujahideen, raised the cost of the occupation, and watched as a decade of war drained Soviet capacity in ways that contributed to the eventual collapse of the empire. The American strategy was not to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, it was to let them defeat themselves there. What is happening in the Persian Gulf right now is the inverse of that pattern, with the United States in the role that the Soviet Union once played, and with China in the role that the United States once played. Beijing is not fighting Washington in the Persian Gulf. It is letting Washington fight there, while quietly accumulating every benefit that long wars in distant theaters historically deliver to the patient power that stays out. The roles are reversed. The lesson is the same. So, where does this go from here? 3 forward scenarios. Scenario 1. The war ends within the next 30 days through a negotiated settlement, possibly with Chinese mediation, possibly through direct talks brokered by Pakistan or Oman. In this scenario, China secures the diplomatic credit for ending a war that the United States started, and that credit becomes a permanent feature of the regional power calculus. Scenario 2. The war continues at low intensity for another 60 to 90 days. The blockade remains, with leakage. Chinese imports of Iranian crude continue at discounted volumes. The CIPS settlement system handles record transaction volumes. The Saudi pivot deepens. In this scenario, the post-war regional architecture is fundamentally different from the pre-war one, with Beijing as the most influential outside power and Washington reduced to the role of an aggrieved enforcer of a system whose benefits its allies have stopped reciprocating. Scenario 3. The war escalates. The blockade triggers a direct confrontation. Oil prices spike toward $150 or beyond. In this scenario, China's gains from cheap Iranian crude are partially offset by the broader economic damage to its export markets. But the diplomatic and strategic gains accelerate further. The narrative of American instability and Chinese reliability becomes the dominant lens through which neutral and non-aligned governments view the global order. What connects all 3 scenarios is that there is no plausible outcome of this war in which China does not emerge in a stronger relative position than it began. The trajectory is set, the infrastructure is in place, the diplomatic capital is being deposited, the financial system is being road-tested, the discount oil is flowing. The strategic patience of Beijing has been validated by the strategic impatience of Washington. That is the deepest structural cost of this war, not the lives lost, not the economic damage, not the alliance friction. The deepest structural cost is that the United States has spent down its strategic capital in a region of declining global importance, against an adversary it could have contained at lower cost, while its principal strategic competitor has used the same period to consolidate gains in a region of increasing global importance. The Persian Gulf War of 2026 will be studied for decades. The most important studies will focus on what was happening in Beijing while Washington was watching Tehran. And they will conclude, as some of us are concluding tonight, that the war Washington thought it was fighting and the war Beijing was actually winning were not the same war. That is where this story sits tonight, in the spaces between the headlines, in the customs data tables that nobody reads. In the port logs at Chabahar. In the settlement volumes at CIPS. In the diplomatic phone calls between Wang Yi and a regional capital that used to take orders from Washington and no longer does. The blockade is still active. The mines are still in the water. The tankers are still loading at Chabahar and arriving in Shandong. Oil is still above $100. And somewhere in Beijing, an analyst at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is updating a quarterly briefing for the Politburo on the strategic gains accumulated during the Iran war. And that briefing is reading better with every week the war continues. Turn on notifications if this kind of structural analysis matters to you. Because the next chapter of this story is not going to be announced from a White House podium. It is going to be visible only in the data, in the contracts, in the shipping lanes, and in the slow rebalancing of a global system whose center of gravity is moving while everyone is watching the explosions.